and oculogyric crisis, elderly patients, and which has subsequently not been seen. So it is thought that this is a sequel of influenza, of that influenza pandemic, and subsequently not seen. Even Zika virus has sort of subsequently to Zika virus, there has been a spurt in the incidence of Guillain-Barré syndrome, and due to perinatal maternal transmission, you get microcephaly and eye infections. Ebola virus was associated with meningitis, and many of the enteroviruses like the enterovirus EV71, which causes hand-foot-mouth disease, or the enterovirus 68, can cause neurological involvement in the form of aseptic meningitis or sort of acute flaccid paralysis, acute flaccid myelitis, which looks like polio, a polioclastic illness. So other coronaviruses, what we have learned from the SARS and the MERS coronavirus, both showed neurotropism, but the neurotropism was not highly common. For example, in SARS, they found that 3 patients had encephalopathy. All of them had proven CNS involvement in the form of either the SARS PCR was positive in the CSF or in the brain tissue. 3 patients presented with encephalopathy with seizures. In MERS, about 5 patients had neurological involvement, slightly different at ADEM and stroke. So the incidence of neurological involvement in these conditions was very low, like 0.04 to 0.2%. So because the COVID is similar to SARS, it was thought that for about, at that point, for about 5 million cases of COVID, there would be about 1800 to 9000 CNS, and about 2,500 to 7,500 about peripheral nervous system involvement for that time in May. So now we have reached about almost 20 million cases. So, okay. So what is the route of entry into the central nervous system? 2 routes are thought to be common. One is via the olfactory nerves. It enters directly from the olfactory nerves via the cribriform plate and into the meninges. This route is also seen in herpes simplex encephalitis. This explains the high incidence of anosmia in COVID meningitis, in COVID. Then the other route of entry is thought to be systemic viremia. Because of systemic viremia, the virus attaches to ACE2 receptors on the brain endothelial cells, vascular endothelial cells, and then enters the CNS. The SARS-CoV has got about a 20-fold higher affinity for ACE2 receptors compared to the SARS, the initial SARS. So up till now, like this review was in June. So up till June, when there were about 5 million cases of COVID, they had reported that 901 cases had CNS involvement, which was reported. See, the number of cases will be higher than what is reported. So about 900 cases were reported then. And so what are the syndromes, or what are the association then? In one UK registry of 125 cases of COVID with neurological manifestations, about 13% had encephalopathy, 6% had encephalitis, and 62% had incidental stroke, stroke on 46% were ischemic, and 7% were hemorrhagic. The figures will vary depending on different studies that I quote. This patient we saw in the OPD, he was a 49-year-old male. He's a hypertensive, non-epileptic, and he was admitted to another hospital with 3 episodes of seizures on one day. He was a non-epileptic, and he had headaches. So he was admitted to the hospital, given anti-epileptics, underwent an MRI scan. He recovered well, and the post the event he was discharged. He came with an MRI, which I'll show later, which showed multiple hemorrhagic lesions. The venogram was normal. Now this patient did not have any fever or any other respiratory symptoms. So he was admitted to a government hospital, but he was not suspected to have COVID at that time because he did not have COVID-related symptoms. All his coagulation parameters were normal, and his whatever workup they did, because he had very peculiar MRI findings, they did for dengue, HIV, etc. was negative. He did not agree for a CSF, and he got himself discharged after 4 or 5 days of treatment. Then he came to me in the OPD for follow-up. So this was his MRI. So for people, for the ones who are not able to read the MRI shows bilateral frontal hemorrhagic lesions. So the image on the right is the gradient echo, which shows those black lesions. They're hemorrhagic lesions in the bilateral frontal region. Such lesions will be seen. DDs of such lesions are either a venous sinus thrombosis or trauma. So he had neither, because his venogram was normal and he had no history of head injury. So these were very peculiar lesions, and the patient had recovered well. So I sent a COVID antibody test, which came high. So the titer was very about 73. So this case was probably a COVID-related meningoencephalitis, but he did very well. So COVID meningoencephalitis will just review. According to the literature, what they say is that patients with encephalitis, they should have evidence of brain inflammation. So any patient with drowsiness will not lead to encephalitis. Patient should have evidence of brain inflammation in the form of either a seizure or a focal neurological deficit. The investigation should show any abnormality in the CNS. Either the CSF should show cells, there should be EEG abnormality, or the MRI should show lesions. Then COVID RNA should be detected in the CSF or in brain tissue, or you may have to demonstrate intrathecal synthesis of antibody. And there should be no alternate cause for meningoencephalitis. For example, herpes or bacterial infections or other etiology should be ruled out. So then this will fall as a case definition of a COVID meningoencephalitis. In case you are not able to detect this COVID PCR RNA on the CSF, then if you detect in non-CNS site, like if you do a throat swab and throat swab comes positive, then it will be a probable case of COVID meningoencephalitis. How many cases of meningoencephalitis were seen in the literature? The first case that was seen was from Japan, where this was a 24-year-old male who came with history of fever, and then he had seizures and he had altered sensorium. When they did the CSF, it showed about 12 cells, and the CSF PCR was positive for COVID. And the MRI showed hyperintensities in the wall of lateral ventricle and the middle temporal lobe. So this was the first case of COVID meningoencephalitis in May or June. Subsequently, there have been about 8 adults with encephalitis. Most of them had symptom onset along with respiratory illness or up to 17 days later. The presentation is with irritability, depressed sensorium, or seizures. One of the case reports was a patient of rhomboencephalitis, where the presentation was slightly different. The patient in that case presented with dizziness, vertigo, facial palsy, and nystagmus and ataxia. And the brain MRI showed a lesion in the brainstem. So this was a rhomboencephalitis. So the spectrum of encephalitis in these different cases are quite different. Some of them showed like CSF abnormality in about 5. Only one of them was documented to be PCR positive on the CSF. But the MRI showed abnormality in 2, EEG showed abnormality in some. So there were about 8 cases of encephalitis with varied presentation. There's no specific treatment for COVID encephalitis. So in the literature, many of them did badly because they also had severe respiratory problems. So next is seizures. How often was COVID present seizures? We have seen 1 or 2 patients who came who are no old patients of epilepsy who came with breakthrough seizures, where the compliance was normal, they had not missed a dose, and they came with breakthrough seizure for no apparent reason. When you asked, they had probably a history of mild fever a day or 2 prior, and they had throat swab positive for COVID. So we had 2 patients like this. In the literature, what they have reported is not so much in adults, but in children, seizures are often a presenting feature. This case report in US showed that 2 infants who came with seizures but without any respiratory involvement, who came only with seizures, and the nasopharyngeal throat swab was positive. In another series, for about 168 children, 3% had seizures. Most of them, like 5 of them, had pre-existing epilepsy, and 1 of them had febrile seizure. So, of the 6, the children who presented with seizures with COVID, all of them had pre-existing epilepsy. So, any patient with epilepsy comes with seizure, they may or may not have involvement. You should always suspect COVID. When there is no apparent cause, like when they have not missed the dose, or when their epilepsy is otherwise well controlled. So that also can be a presenting feature. This thing is the most common presentation, COVID-related encephalopathy. Most of the patients with COVID come with altered sensorium, agitation, restlessness, even drowsiness. And this is the most common neurological presentation. There are multiple factors. For example, hypoxia can be one cause, metabolic derangements can be one cause, drug cytokine release. All this can cause CNS involvement. So hypoxia is like most of the patients who come with respiratory involvement, they have severe hypoxia who come to the hospital. So in this post-mortem study about patients who died with COVID, even if it was not suspected morbidly, post-mortem about 20% had changes of hypoxic encephalopathy on the brain. So even if they're happy hypoxics, there are the patients who died, about 1 in 5 showed brain damage because of hypoxia. So the encephalopathy is the most common presentation where patients will present with altered sensorium. So the first study from Wuhan of about 214 patients, most of the patients who had neurological symptoms. So this was of neurological symptoms in COVID. About 17% had dizziness and 13% had headache, and encephalopathy was present in about 7%. And most of them had severe respiratory disease. So encephalopathy is multifactorial again, not due to COVID involvement of the CNS. So you can document by doing MRI and CSF. If they are normal, then it is more likely encephalopathy. In a French study of about 58 ICU patients, the incidence of encephalopathy was much higher than in the Chinese group. So encephalopathy, like you see, is in more seriously ill patients, like patients who have hypoxia, who are on the in the ICU or ventilator. So here about 69% had encephalopathy in the form of agitation or delirium. And the MRI showed subtle meningeal enhancement only, but no parenchymal involvement. So confusion as a presenting symptom of COVID. Recently, there have been some case reports of in elderly patients of patients presenting with only confusion or altered sensorium, where it is actually a presenting symptom of COVID. There was this case report from US of about four elderly patients who in a nursing care home where the four elderly patients who had dementia presented with altered sensorium. And there was no fever, no cough, or no respiratory distress. And the chest X-ray was abnormal. And subsequently, when they did the throat COVID swab, it was positive. So COVID can present as encephalopathy or even just as a confusional state where because patients are elderly and demented, they may not have much of respiratory tract symptoms which they may not report. The confusion, like we all know, like elderly patients who come with even UTI can present with confusion. So it should be probably kept as one of the DDs so as to be aware that when a patient comes with altered sensorium, that it can be COVID. So I'll show one more case. This was a patient who was admitted in Karuna. She came with a GBS-like picture. This was a 60-year-old female, non-diabetic and hypertensive. She came with history of imbalance and numbness in the hands since 2 days. She had come to Dr. Hunnur's OPD. She had a mild proximal weakness and a left facial palsy. She had ataxia. She could not do tandem walk, and the reflexes were depressed. He did an MRI of the brain and spine, which was normal. So clinically, it was a patient with a short history of ataxia, cranial nerve palsies, and depressed reflexes. So it looked like a GBS Miller-Fisher variant. So she was admitted as our protocol. So we admitted in the second floor ICU pending the throat swab, and we were about to treat her as normal GBS with IVIG. Then her throat swab came positive. So for COVID. So subsequently we held on to the IVIG, saw how the progression was, and because it was Miller-Fisher syndrome, luckily she did not progress much. She went to the first floor COVID ward, and then she improved without treatment, and she did well. So, so we'll talk about the peripheral nervous system involvement in COVID. There are two post-infectious syndromes. One is ADEM, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, and the second is GBS. These occur usually within 6 weeks of an acute infection. So COVID RNA can be detected in throat swab, but it may be negative also, because if it is like several weeks after the onset of COVID, then you may have to rely on antibody. So ADEM was reported in about 2 patients with COVID, and 2 patients presented with brain demyelinating lesions. These are very typical on the MRI. So many infectious conditions can lead to post-infectious acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. So 2 patients had ADEM with COVID PCR positive, and 1 patient in China presented acute myelitis with a cord demyelination. All of these patients responded to steroids. 2 got steroids and 1 patient got IVIG because they were worried about giving steroids in that situation. So, but all 3 patients did well. There is a one case report of acute necrotizing hemorrhagic encephalopathy in a middle-aged female. This is interesting in the situation because acute necrotizing hemorrhagic encephalopathy you will see most commonly in children. and it is most often reported after influenza. Here we would see necrotizing brain infections after dengue. Uh, but this lady had COVID, and she was a middle-aged female, and she had bilateral brain in the thalamus and the cerebellum hemorrhagic lesions. So this has been also like described in COVID. Then GBS. GBS has been described very often, like about 19 patients have been reported with GBS. We have also seen one patient, so it's not so uncommon. Uh, the symptoms usually present up to 7 days after respiratory features. So they get respiratory illness, and then after a few days, like a post-infectious syndrome, they will get symptoms. But two patients in this review, no, there are two patients had fever after the GBS onset, and that's when they suspected that it could be COVID. GBS is typical like post-infectious GBS. Most of them were demyelinating on the electrophysiology. 8 of them went to develop respiratory failure. Two patients had Miller-Fisher syndrome like our patient. And it was diagnosed with throat swab in about 16, and one they had to do an antibody. CSF did not detect the virus in any of these patients with GBS in the world literature. 15 of them received IVIG. Like I said, most of them had respiratory failure, and 2 of them died. So the overlap of respiratory involvement because of COVID as well as GBS probably is a more difficult thing to handle. But you can treat normally as you do with for IVIG. So this is the third case. This is a 52-year-old male smoker who had mild in June. And 3 weeks later, he came with dysarthria and facial weakness. He was admitted to hospital. There was no arm or leg weakness. He had a mild stroke, so he recovered well. The MRI showed a left MCA patchy infarcts. He didn't have hypertension or diabetes, no other risk factors. The MR angio also was normal. 2D echo was normal. His LDL was 148, borderline high. Sugars were normal. D-dimer was normal. So this is like several weeks after the initial respiratory illness. So he also had COVID. So he had very patchy infarcts in the left MCA posteriorly. If you see in the MCA diary, very patchy cortical infarcts. These are usually embolic. So in the presence of a normal angiogram and a normal echo, these are probably embolus from undetermined sources. So these are not lacunar infarcts because they're very cortical. This. So and because he had no other risk factors for COVID, no other risk factors for a stroke, we, apart from smoking, we sent for the COVID antibody. Again, the COVID antibody was positive. So this was a patient of COVID with stroke. So all the neurological presentations, encephalopathy being common, the direct neurological involvement is most often seen as a stroke in the setting of COVID. So when you see a stroke event with COVID, throat swab positive or antibody positive, and there's no other additional risk factor, then it is probably related to COVID. It's a COVID-related stroke. In Wuhan, they found that the incidence of stroke was about 6% in the neurological series. So it is quite high. Then in other groups, like in Italy and all, there was a 1.6 to 2.5% incidence of stroke in their intensive care unit patients. In Italy, this study showed that patients who had stroke were already on DVT prophylaxis, despite that they got stroke. Up till now, about 88 patients have been described with ischemic stroke, and 8 have been described with hemorrhagic stroke, and 1 patient with cortical venous thrombosis. There's a very high mortality. 19% of them died. So this is a very high mortality for stroke. So there are several mechanisms for stroke, like there is inflammation leading to cytokine production, endothelial dysfunction, increase in the procoagulant factors like D-dimer and fibrinogen. There's activation of monocytes, which can lead to HLH, hemophagocytosis like syndrome. Definitely COVID has a microangiopathy, like we have seen there's thrombocytopenia and elevated D-dimer. So it causes a thrombotic microangiopathy. So it predisposes patients to thrombotic conditions like you are more well aware of this, but also stroke. So stroke symptoms can present usually in the review. They found that stroke symptoms presented 10 days after respiratory illness on average for the mean. 5 patients had only cerebrovascular symptoms. Like my patient, my patient did not have any respiratory symptoms or respiratory findings. Most of the stroke patients were above 60. and they had other risk factors like the hypertensive, diabetic, or whatever. There's a 5 case series of stroke in a single center in US, which were young stroke. And for that center, they said that the incidence of young stroke in that center was very high during COVID. So they found that these 5 patients had large artery stroke, and there was no other risk factors when during the evaluation. The echo, cardiac function, everything was normal. So in stroke, often we find in COVID that there are multiple infarcts. They have in thrombotic evidence in more than one area. Like they may have thrombus in aorta, they may have limb ischemia, and very often they will have evidence of deep venous thrombosis in the legs or pulmonary embolism. Most of the patients with stroke have a high elevated D dimer. There is a role for heparin anticoagulation. So for an acute stroke, like stroke being so common in the population, so it is very difficult in the COVID era to determine which patient has COVID and which patient doesn't have COVID, because the time is of the essence in a treatment of stroke. So when a patient comes with stroke, you really cannot think whether they have COVID or not. So you have to have a protected, they have this term called protected stroke code, where patients are sort of kept in a separate designated area for evaluation, like our second floor ICU, where whether they have COVID or not, we keep them there. We evaluate them in the same way. Then one thing to do is probably to do CT chest and brain in the urgent setting. So you will be able to at least identify patients who have abnormality on the CT chest and therefore COVID, who are presenting with COVID-related stroke. Treatment would be the same, but then your precautions would be probably more for the ICU. Separate CT or angio suit is not possible in our setting, at least. Then appropriate sanitization is what we can do. Then patient should be put on at least a surgical mask. For stroke, they say that probably you should not use MRI so often. So use MRI sparingly. For at least treatment of stroke, for thrombolysis and for mechanical thrombectomy, for everything, CT and CT angio is sufficient. So we need not rely too much on MRI, because to decontaminate, sanitize an MRI is more difficult. So use MRI sparingly. Only when you want to really see the window, the onset of stroke by using diffusion flare, etc. Only then you use MRI. Treat these strokes as you would treat a normal stroke. Many of the stroke patients have been thrombolized with alteplase or tenecteplase. What the stroke specialists recommend is that you normally don't wait for reports for stroke, but because these patients have a coagulopathy, it's not a bad thing to check for platelets, PTT, and D dimer. So whether to wait for the reports to thrombolize or not is up to the clinician. Mechanical thrombectomy should be offered for stroke patients when it is indicated. So what are the other? There are some other presentations of COVID. For example, one case report of muscle injury where they found elevated CPK in about 11% of COVID. Then one patient of rhabdomyolysis. Then loss of smell and taste, like we all are aware, it's very common. So this Dutch study showed that anosmia and ageusia is about 80%. This is quite high. Other series, the incidence varies, so from 20 to 40%. The incidence of anosmia is much higher than what you see in other URTIs. Probably because it also involves the olfactory nerves, and that is probably one of the routes for CNS penetration. It is more common than you would see in influenza pandemic or other URTI. You can get multiple cranial nerve palsies. Sixth nerve palsy, when there are case reports of unilateral and bilateral sixth nerve palsies, case reports of vestibular neuritis like syndrome. Facial palsy has not been reported, but facial palsy is so common, Bell's palsy is so common that it's very difficult to attribute it to COVID. And like in our OPD, we almost see like during this COVID times, one patient of Bell's palsy almost every day or every alternate day, which is a bit higher than what you would normally see. So the incidence of Bell's palsy is definitely higher in this COVID setting, but we have not been able to document, because to do COVID testing was difficult for only Bell's palsy. You really not image all. Then critical illness neuropathy is not reported, but it is thought that patients who are on ventilator and with respiratory failure may develop this syndrome also. So the overall presenting this timeline of COVID-related events. So the first 2 weeks, you would get the viral RNA, and from the third and fourth, from the first week onwards, you will get the antibody positive. So the encephalitis is seen most commonly in the first 2 weeks. The demyelinating illnesses come somewhere in between, like after the first week, myelitis and ADM have been reported after the first week. GBS has been reported right from the onset of symptoms up to 3 weeks also. Stroke has been seen throughout the spectrum of COVID, like along with the onset of COVID to as late as 4 weeks after the COVID also. So the viral conditions like encephalitis, etc., will be seen in the first 2 weeks. The para-infectious conditions can occur anywhere up to 4 weeks, and stroke or the vascular conditions can occur anywhere up to 4 weeks. So just one last slide on what to do in patients who have pre-existing illness, like patients who are on immunosuppressant, so patients with multiple sclerosis, myasthenia gravis, or neuromyelitis optica, so who are on immunosuppressants. So most of the people recommend that for multiple sclerosis, some of these drugs like interferon or glatiramer. So there is interest in interferon in the treatment of COVID also. So interferon is quite safe for COVID. It doesn't cause much immunosuppression. Other oral drugs also can be continued. If the patient is on azathioprine or mycophenolate, and if a person comes to you that should I continue immunosuppression, it can be continued. To start a new immunosuppression is a little bit risky, so you have to look at the risk versus benefit. Drugs like rituximab should be deferred. Like if the patient is on 6 monthly rituximab infusion, you should try to delay the rituximab by about 2 to 3 months. One way to do it is check the CD19 count. If it is low, then you can delay the rituximab injection by about 3 months. If a patient comes with COVID and on immunosuppressants which can cause lymphopenia, like etc., then the drug should be stopped. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore Shetty, for a very exhaustive and very lucidly presented session. We would like to take some questions here itself before we move on to our next session. So let me begin by asking you, Dr. Shetty, what I want to ask is that in COVID we use steroids, and in stroke and meningoencephalitis we use steroids. So do you think there is a role for a higher dose of steroid, because we've got the stroke as well as we've got endothelialitis, and we want some immune suppression to reduce the cytokine storm? So is there a place for a higher steroid in CNS manifestation of COVID?
For the demyelinating diseases, yes, like ADEM and all, they have used a pulse dose of steroids, Solumetol. For the encephalitis, there's so little case reports that we don't know what to do. So, how much steroid to use because the virus, like when they extrapolate with the SARS virus, the virus has some neurotropism, but it is not highly neurovirulent. Like herpes virus, it doesn't cause lot of neuronal destruction. So this is like my personal opinion. There's no evidence. So much of the damage, even in the COVID-related encephalitis, is probably related to inflammation. So probably related to the cytokine storm, or there have been like whatever studies they're doing, they're showing that there are some increased markers of CXCL9, etc. in the CSF in these patients of COVID. So more than the virus, it's the inflammation. So yes, probably there is a role for steroid, but nobody has recommended. So we wouldn't know what dose to use.
Right.
And also none of the antivirals that we use for COVID have got CNS penetration. So that is one thing that you are worried about, that remdesivir and the other things, they don't have good CNS penetration. The only thing that has got good CNS penetration was hydroxychloroquine, which has probably got a very sort of bad name by now. Okay. Yeah.
So Dr. Manoj Hunur is here. You also please take the question. My second question is that, when in the lungs the ARDS increases and there is a lot of inflammation, we try to use tocilizumab to reduce, IL-6 receptor blocker to reduce the inflammation with a lot of success. And there are certain subgroup of patients we find that there is a CNS inflammation. So do you think there is a place for TOSI in a pure CNS inflammatory condition, which you think might be because of this immune-related phenomenon? Dr. Hunur, I'd like you to take the answer along with Dr. Shetty. You can unmute yourself and please answer.
We have not seen much of that kind of scenario where somebody requires TOSI and it was NKF. Whatever we have seen, most of them were hypoxic. And they were altered because of the hypoxia. They were restless because of the hypoxia. And once their hypoxia settled, they were quite comfortable. In these patients, there might be a possibility that they might be having underlying some amount of CNS inflammation, as Dr. Shetty said. But unfortunately, it is very difficult to prove. We have not been able to do a CS because most of these patients are so hypoxic, oxygen. So as you said, it is a possibility, but most of them, we look at it as more of a hypoxic encephalopathy.
Great.
Because as Dr. Shetty said, 20% of the post-mortem studies have shown
hypoxia.
So hypoxia possibly is a bigger problem than inflammation itself.
Okay, so there is a little to differentiate clinically whether it could be inflammatory or hypoxia to make that kind of a clinical decision.
Absolutely.
We can't do MRI.
Okay. Dr. Shetty, would you like to add something on this?
See, for us, like when we see patients with the altered sensorium, unless there are seizures, unless patient has convulsions, most of these patients will be encephalopathy, not encephalitis. So most of these patients will be encephalopathy due to, again, hypoxia, multiple metabolic factors, the cytokine storm, inflammation, so those things. So you have to then treat mainly for the respiratory thing. Like I reviewed the French this. So in there are about 60 patients of COVID in the ICU. Almost 67% of patients had encephalopathy. So they would treat it as COVID with the respiratory problem primarily. So the brain involvement would be an encephalopathy as an indirect effect. So that should probably not have bearing on the treatment. And you suspect encephalitis only when there is CNS involvement. Either the patient gets convulsions, or they get focal findings, or they have abnormal CSF. In our setting, it's very difficult to do MRI in a patient with COVID. So, and it is the same everywhere else.
Great. So Dr. Ravindra Tilak is asking, what about third cranial nerve involvement? Is that common? And second thing he wants to ask is, what about the antibody response if somebody gets just a solitary olfactory nerve involvement? Is that presenting common symptom?
Yes, so olfactory involvement is thought to be a good sign, because most of them who have olfactory involvement don't have severe respiratory.
Yeah, just to add, sir.
Yeah, Dr.
So just to add, this is my daughter asking the question because she was positive, and she had isolated olfactory nerve involvement, and the antibody test which we did not show any antibodies, and she's back in the COVID ICU looking after Hinduja ICU patients.
Okay, that's interesting.
So that's why the antibody response we don't know. That's what we are asking.
Hi, sir. Yeah, sorry to interrupt like that unceremoniously, but I just wanted to know about the antibody response post only the olfactory nerve involvement, because I just had a loss of taste and a loss of smell, nothing else. I had no fever, I had no weakness, nothing. It was just this, and after that, when they tested my antibody levels, it was negative. So I'm not really making an association between the less antibody response and cranial nerve involvement, but maybe the entire, the entire intensity of symptomatology was so less that the antibody response wasn't elucidated after that. We don't know, sir.
We don't know. So
especially in in epidemiology, actually we use antibody testing to determine what is the proportion of population that is involved. So I don't know whether you would be a one-off case or whether that's a trend, whether pure olfactory nerve there would be no antibody response, or whether mild cases or asymptomatic cases will have less response. Because in that case, the epidemiological survey will not really show the extent of infection in the community.
So the problem comes if there is no antibody, then you think there's a subsequent chance of a reinfection. That is our main worry.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's everybody's worries, including mine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Dr. Beena is asking about a 65 years with UTI, altered sensorium, MRI normal, CSF normal, sorts of negative. What are the tests needed which could diagnose? Okay, you may probably have to repeat the COVID, or maybe COVID is negative and the patient may have something else.
Yeah.
So let's go on to Dr. Amya. He is asking whether you are seeing an increase in venous thrombosis cases, because rightfully the cardiac cases are venous thrombosis and in the brain it is arterial thrombosis. Is that the case? So what is the difference? Can we highlight that?
Yeah, yes. So, surprisingly, like the cortical venous thrombosis, only one case has been reported. So much of them have been all arterial thrombosis. So we don't know because most of the procoagulant situation, you would get more incidence of venous sinus thrombosis. But in the literature, also in our personal experience, we've not seen CVTs more commonly. So cortical venous sinus thrombosis is not seen often. In literature also, it's more arterial for us. We don't know. So it's a strange disease.
Yes. So interestingly, if there is a myocardial infarction and they do an angiography,
Jacob.
that comes normal. Yeah, please.
Jacob, in the last 4 months, we have seen most probably about four cortical venous sinus thrombosis. We worked them up all for COVID and all were negative. So we haven't seen any COVID-related venous.
Okay. But in MI, as Dr. Amya might highlight in the next session, we are going to get most of the cases which will be venous thrombosis. So we will take more questions towards the end. We will go to our next session, and that is the cardiological involvement. And just today, we have one patient in the ICU whose CPK MB and tropi is very high. Tropi is 60 and CPK MB around 150 something. And I did a 2D echo, and Dr. Amya, I found that there was a generalized hypokinesia of the LV and around 45 to 50% of the LV ejection fraction. So we have a cardiac involvement in COVID with LV dysfunction. So these and similar involvement or other involvement of the heart, Dr. Amya Udayawar is going to highlight to us. And so I invite Dr. Amya to take his slide. He's been with us for many years. And, over to Dr. Amya, please.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I think I'm audible to everyone.
Yeah, you are audible. Please go on.
My talk is COVID and the heart. A little interesting topic. So, Dr. Anthony Fauci, we all are aware, he is the director of the National Institute of Health. He says that the virus is a formidable foe. And I think the truth is very much true, because if you see, the epidemic has reached proportions of almost immense magnitude, 20 million cases worldwide and causing almost 7.5 lakh deaths. In India itself, we are dealing with almost 50,000 deaths now, almost. And there has been no system of the body which has been spared. In fact, you name the system from ophthalmology to ENT to CNS to cardiac, all the systems are involved. So if you see SARS-CoV-2, we all know incubation period is 10 days, maximum 14 days. Reproducibility rate is 2 to 3. And we classify that as mild, moderate, and severe. So patients who need oxygen, basically because of low saturation, are classified as severe disease, and patients who are in respiratory failure or septic shock or multi-organ failure are classified as critical disease. While the other two subset, where there is a mild illness of fever or sore throat or just a pneumonia but without any need for oxygen, can be classified as mild or moderate. So if you see, 80% of the patients will have mild to moderate disease, but there are 20%. So 14% are in the severe severity, and out of that 5% will be critical. So these are the subset we will be more worried about. And why is that? Because if you see the fatality, patients with cardiovascular disease who are admitted in the ICU in China, in Italy, in Spain, and in US showed that cardiovascular disease was the highest underlying medical condition, and it carried the highest mortality rate. Diabetes was the next, chronic respiratory illnesses, and cancer. So these were the illnesses which had the highest mortality rate. So how does it affect the heart? Number one is that it can directly enter the cardiomyocyte or the myocyte and infect the cell. Okay, so direct myocardial involvement. So that is one. But this is very rare. Cardiac, directly the cell getting invaded by the virus is extremely rare. What is more common is immunopathology or hyperinflation. So where there is an immune system which gets activated, and that gets activated and then starts getting damaging the cardiac myocyte. That is much more common. So that will cause a variety of manifestations in the form of myocarditis, arrhythmias, acute coronary syndromes, and heart failure. So if you see the progression of the COVID disease, we all know the first 5 days is basically mild fever with sore throat or something like that. And there is a viremia. So the virus is multiplying, expanding in your body. So it's increasing in your bloodstream. And in the second stage, it starts invading the lungs where you get the pulmonary phase. And after 10 days, it goes into what is called a hyperinflation phase. Now, this is the stage when the cardiac muscle is going to be involved, the stage 3. So first 7 days of fever is normally because of some viral replication, viremia. But after some time, the fever settles down. In the second week, again, the patient starts complaining of breathlessness, fatigue, dyspnea, or other manifestations. So this is when the elevated inflammatory markers or the cardiac markers because of hyperinflation, you get this stage. So symptom-wise, fever, most common, shortness of breath is another. And if you see complication-wise, cardiac abnormalities, seeing almost 20% of patients will have myocarditis. Now, this is patients in critical care, patients who are admitted to the ICUs, not in the normal ward patients. So these are all studies done in critical care patients. So cardiac abnormalities, 20% had myocarditis, 33% had cardiomyopathy, what is called LV failure, and 44% had arrhythmias. So if you see the manifestations, the most common manifestation is acute, the second one, the acute myocardial injury, which is without any obstructive coronary artery disease. Now, this is definitely because of myocarditis. So myocarditis, which is either immunity-based or immunity-induced. And the second is stress cardiomyopathy, lot of stress, sympathetic overload causing the cardiac dilatation. And the third is direct infection of the myocytes. So this all can cause myocarditis. The second is acute coronary syndrome, for example, a heart attack. So ST elevation MI. So can cause ST elevation MI because of increased thrombosis in the arteries. Arrhythmias causing due to myocarditis can cause heart failure. If it's very severe, it can cause what is called as cardiogenic shock, pericardial effusion, and thromboembolic complications. So this is one of the case reports. You see ST elevation in ECG, leads 1, 2, and leads AVR, AVL, and V4, V5, all of them show ST elevation. On the X-ray, there is slight haziness, but the coronaries are totally normal. And when you do an echo, LV ejection fraction is on the lower side, LV dysfunction of almost 30%. So again, a myocarditis which is presenting as ST elevation MI on the ECG. Again, this is myopericarditis. So pericardium, when the pericardium gets involved, you can get these changes. So if you see the ECGs, lot of ST elevation in lead V1, V2. So here AVL laterally, 1 and AVL will show ST elevation. In the C panel, you have atrial fibrillation which is going on. And in the D panel, you have again STT changes in lead 1, AVL, and V4, V6. So again, manifesting as STT changes because of myocarditis. We have seen a slight increase in acute myocardial infarctions. Now it is difficult to tell because is it because of the COVID virus per se or because of increased thrombosis. It could be because of stress, which is induced because of isolation, stress because of tension that I'm bound to home, whether I'll have COVID. So that could be one of the causes which may cause plaque rupture and cause acute MI. So here you have ST elevation in leads 2, 3 AVF presenting of acute MI, and patient is thrombolized, and you see the ST elevation settles down. So definitely a slight uptick in the manifestations. Here you have a patient of cardiogenic shock, LVF almost going down to 15 to 20%. Now in these situations where the ejection fraction suddenly collapses to 15-20%, one needs to support the heart by what is called as the ECMO, which is called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, because there's nothing else to support the heart. We may put him on the ventilator, but that will take care of the respiratory system. But for the cardiac system, you need to give some device which will support the heart, either an intra-aortic balloon pump or a LV assist device, which are difficult in India. But ECMO, I think 3-4 of the private hospitals have it. Now, why is myocardial involvement so important? You see, this is a study which was done in almost 400 ICU patients, and you have troponin. Troponin is a specific enzyme which is present in the heart, gets released because of myocardial. If you see the patients who had the highest troponin, the highest level, the patients with cardiovascular disease who were already known for the cardiovascular disease with the highest troponin, have the highest mortality. Biomarkers called antiprobenity is seen when you have heart failure. When you have heart failure, you have antiprobenity which would increase. Again, hospitalized patients, patients who expired had higher values than patients who got cured or who went home. So again, cardiac markers, troponin, antiprobenity, both are cardiac biomarkers. So when you have increase in cardiac biomarkers, more chance of getting complications. Of course, this will also correlate with your inflammatory markers, especially interleukin-6, serum ferritin, and CRP. So this all shows that it is a part of inflammation. So this inflammation is not only involving the respiratory tract and the lungs, but also the myocardium, and it is quite common. So presentation, it could be because of like MI, ST elevation MI. It could cause heart failure, which is decompensated. It could cause a very severe form of heart failure, which is called cardiogenic shock. And it could also cause this. This is one of my patients who presented with recurrent VTs, and all of a sudden, he had no fever, but then recurrent VTs, he was receiving almost 20-30 shocks in a day. So this is very unusual for a VT to happen that frequent, unless there is a ischemia or acute heart attack. So we would suspect, especially with this COVID going around, whether this is something to do with myocarditis. Troponin I level is almost 12,000. Normal value is less than 0.05. So you have a 0.05 level, and here you have a troponin I level which is 12,000. Swab test was done, which was negative. The MRI showed RA-RV dilatation. So this was suggestive of a condition called arrhythmogenic RV dysplasia. Now this is a chronic condition. But at the same time, the MRI also picked up what is called inflammation and edema. Now this is acute condition. So inflammation and edema normally you will see only in acute myocarditis. So after almost a week of medication, cooling down the ventricular tachycardia, the patient settled down and started getting fever. That is when we did a COVID swab test and it came positive. So we had to wait for another 2 weeks for him to settle down to put an ICD for him. So again, a presentation causing ventricular tachycardia because of myocarditis. This is the case report which showed AV block. So AV block presenting as COVID. And this is another case report of atrial fibrillation. This is a little common because of the use of HCQ, azithromycin, leponavir, and ritonavir, which is long QT syndrome. So long QT, when you give prolonged QT interval on the ECG, you will have what is called as polymorphic VF, which is called as Torsades de Pointes. This is the side effect of the drug. So especially when you have a lot of drugs which can prolong the QT, you will have this. So this is very common. So we strongly recommend not to use high doses of azithromycin, HCQ, especially in these patients. So arrhythmias, the whole gamut, AV block, AF, polymorphic VT, and pulseless electrical activity, including cardiac arrest. So all these arrhythmias can present as COVID. So how do you treat them? Once you suspect myocarditis, You do a daily ECG, do a cardiac enzyme, do an echo, see whether there's any coronary involvement, rule out coronary artery blockages. After that, if possible, do a MRI and consider endocardial myocardial biopsy. So this is a biopsy which is done by going into the heart transluminally and taking part of the tissue. So that is the conclusive diagnosis. Of course, it is difficult to do in today's setting. Treatment-wise, I think the treatment is the same. You need to treat the heart failure. You need to you need to activate the cardiogenic shock protocol and stabilize them with devices like ECMO and IABP. Steroids, especially when it is myocarditis because of inflammation, do have a role and definitely work. What about thrombosis? Now this is proven beyond doubt that there has been increase in the thrombosis rate. Arterial thrombosis rates 2 to 6%, venous thrombosis rate almost 7 to 30% in patients who were surveillance was done. In patients who were no surveillance, almost 70%. So definitely there has been an increase. And this correlates with a D dimer which is high. So if the patient has a D dimer which is high on admission, there's very highly chance that this patient is having ongoing thrombosis because of the increased inflammation. And this is always associated with an increased fibrinogen level. And if you see how do you differentiate between DIC and COVID and microangiopathy, you see the fibrinogen levels. So everything will be almost same, PT elevated, APTT elevated, D dimer elevated, platelets may be low, but the fibrinogen in COVID is extremely high, while in DIC it is low. So this is one of the test differentiating factors. So what we are currently following in hospital is that all patients of COVID, irrespective of their D dimer levels, because they are almost tied down to a bed, we are starting them on prophylactic venous thromboembolic prophylaxis, which is Clexane or enoxaparin. So that is given at an intermediate intensity dose of 0.5 milligram kg twice a day. And the patients who have a higher D dimer or who have breathlessness, whose all inflammatory markers like CRP, interleukin 6 are elevated, they go on the therapeutic range of the enoxaparin. So for standard, it is 40 milligram BID for prophylaxis, and for therapeutic, it's almost 60 milligram BID. Now this is a table. I won't go into the details of this one. I'll go in the detail of this one. So if you have a patient with COVID symptom and you feel that the patient has increased risk of thrombolism, especially increased respiratory rate, increased CRP, increased D dimer, elevated fibrinogen, these patients need to be on enoxaparin 1 milligram per kg BID. That is the drug of choice. Okay. And what about discharge? A lot of times we have seen till the time of discharge, these patients still continue to, they have very high D dimers. And there have been studies now that up to 45 days, these patients may have higher chance of DVT. And that's why in those patients, we are giving them extended prophylaxis in the form of Novavax. So during discharge, especially if the patient have higher D dimer values, we are continuing the dabigatran or Novax or apixaban or enoxaparin for at least 6 weeks as prophylactic to rule out, prevent venous thrombosis. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Ameya Udayawar. Can you brief some personal experience with patients that you may have seen and a proportion of cases that you have seen with cardiac involvement?
See, cardiac involvement, at least in the ward, we are not seeing so much. Out of maybe 100, we may see 3 or 4 in the ward. But critical care, definitely there is much more, because critical care, it is difficult to say it is whether it is only because of COVID, because septicemia or septic shock or even inflammatory cytokine storm itself can cause cardiac involvement. So there the involvement may be almost in the range of 50 to 60%, especially in the critical care setting. So there the involvement is definitely less. Arrhythmias definitely more, almost 40 to 50% of the patients will have arrhythmias. Again, long QT, depending on the drugs which one is giving, maybe 15 to 20%. Till now, I have seen in the general ward setting, at least 5 patients with AV block and complete heart block. And when we tested for COVID, they came positive. So they didn't have any COVID symptoms. But when we did their COVID test for pre-ops testing, all of them came positive. So we have slightly an increase in AV block and complete heart blocks, which we are seeing. Myocarditis slightly increase in ventricular ectopics and VT. So that is what we are seeing. I think this is normally seen in patients who are little more severely affected. The mild to moderate variety, that 80%, which form the majority of them are 80%, which are only like mild or moderate type. So in that subset, we see it less. It's not that frequent. But in the severe and the critical patients, there the incidence is definitely ranging from 20 to almost 50%.
And secondly, sudden death in COVID patients is generally attributed to 3 or 4 major things. One is pulmonary thromboembolism. Second is a severe stroke. And the third is an MI. So what is the proportion of MI as a factor causing sudden death in COVID patients?
See, we don't have Indian data, but now we have data from Italy and Spain. So they studied last, because what happened was during the COVID time, especially in Italy, Spain, and US, the angioplasties, the primary heart attacks all reduced. So the PAMI interventional work which was done, suddenly all of a sudden came to a standstill because patients were afraid to go to the hospital. But what they observed was an increase in the sudden cardiac arrest death. So the CPR rates had gone up. The emergency services were dealing with more calls and more cardiac arrest. So especially in Italy, this is published data in the journal Circulation and JACC, which mentioned that they had higher cardiac arrest. So most probably patients are fearful of going to the hospital. Even if they have symptoms, they are staying at home thinking that it may not be because of the heart. It may settle down in a day or two, and they're taking the risk. So all the cardiac societies now, they have started an active campaign that if you have symptoms, contact your doctor, get yourself.
No, I was basically referring to sudden death in COVID patients. Have 3 major involvements: pulmonary thromboembolism, stroke, and MI. But you know, we don't know the proportion which causes MI, because we are suddenly faced with patients who we have had cases sudden deaths in the wards, and then we have to label them something. So we have to grope for the symptoms. You know, like I mentioned initially, a patient suddenly became comatose, but he was not tachypnic, and we took an ECG. The ECG was was normal, and his pupils were dilated. This was very early on in the COVID epidemic. So we labeled him as probably a CVA.
So we have seen 2 deaths in the ward in our the hospital Hinduja, where we had 2 deaths suddenly in the wards. So there must be some component of cardiac arrest there. But then to say whether it is because of COVID may be slightly difficult, because there are so many factors, you know, electrolyte imbalance, cold heart attack, LV function which is low. So it could be a combination of these 2, but definitely at least I can say 2 patients who had a cardiac arrest. I've also heard of 2-3 of my, not neighbors, but then through known contacts, that they had some problem and they died suddenly. So difficult to tell whether it is because of COVID.
Anybody in the doctors, if you have any queries for Dr. Amya or Dr. Shetty or Dr. Hunood, please you can unmute and ask also, or put in the chat box. I'll also like to ask Dr. Amya that there has been a lot of inertia in doing a 2D echo, but now that we have overcome part of this inertia and have been doing it, we are seeing certain things like, you know, you have acute pulmonary hypertension, you have LV dysfunction and all setting in. So do you think that will help in the management of the patient?
Echo setting is basically if you have sudden change in the clinical condition, echo will definitely help. If you have a clinical condition which is more or less same, so then the echo may not give you a lot of information. But a patient who is stable, suddenly all of a sudden becomes breathless, saturation going down, and you suspect there are cracks in the chest, and some ECG changes suggestive of a myocardial infarction. So there definitely an echo will.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Amya. That was very good. Dr. Nandan is asking the neurologist that in a COVID with stroke, when we discharge, what should we advise? Ecosprin or NOAC or both? Dr. Shetty or Dr. Hunur, can you please take this question? When we discharge, what do we do? Ecospirin or NOAC or both?
Many of them will have the normal atherosclerotic risk factors. So one is that you work them up for the normal atherosclerotic risk factors, and most of them then would be needing antiplatelet. Another thing is probably look at the D-dimer. Like Dr. Ameya pointed out, if the D-dimer is high and there are no other atherosclerotic risk factors, then you would think of using anticoagulation. No, there are no guidelines where you have to use your own judgment. Today, there has been a sort of report of patients with neurological involvement having high incidence of intracranial hemorrhages also. So, as we go, we are learning. So, we really cannot put forward that this is the thing that should be done. But probably, if the patient has normal atherosclerotic risk factors, then you treat as a normal stroke. If they have no risk factors, look at the D-dimer. But also see that they also have a risk of hemorrhage. So you have to look, take all the factors into consideration and then make a decision.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kishore. I hope that satisfies Dr. Nandan. And is there any more question? Dr. Ravindra Bhatnagar want to say something?
See, initially when we started the team program, every day we were getting 3 deaths of cardiac arrest in the casualty. Dr. Kavita mentioned every time there were 3 cardiac, and we were really not sure whether they were due to the other factors like cancer, like MI, like whatever, or they were due to COVID. It was very difficult to convince our relatives at that stage when the patient was brought dead to have a COVID test, because who would pay for it? The logistics was very difficult. So we really don't know. The pure psychosis is so much people prefer to die and commit suicide at home rather than come to a COVID positive hospital. That is slowly and surely changing. So I would like to thank everybody for that also, because we are actually propagating the people coming now. So we're getting more of non-COVID cases and suspect cases also. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that is why this thing about sudden deaths, that's why I was discussing, because that will help us to clinically differentiate something and maybe give some kind of a provisional diagnosis to the cause of that. It's either pulmonary thromboembolism or an MI or a stroke. These 3 things can cause sudden death in COVID. So if there is no more question, I thank everybody, all the doctors. We have had a very wonderful session, neurology and cardiological manifestation. So thank you very much. So with your permission, Dr. Bhatnagar, let me end this session. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.